Welcome to the Macon Atlanta podcast, where we are talking to interesting Atlantans about the good life and how they pursue the good life. Alex Edquist is the founder and CEO of Good Agriculture, which is a startup that supports regenerative farmers with business back office services so they can do what they do best, produce nourishing food and steward the land. Alex was previously an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company, where we worked together. She specialized in data analytics and strategy operations, and she was also a business manager for the Atlanta Committee for Progress, where she helped launch the Center for Workforce Innovation with diverse partners in Atlanta. She has a bachelor's and master's in economics from the University of Georgia and is a good Georgia Bulldog all the way through. We had an awesome conversation about regenerative agriculture and just the space, what can be possible when you get a bunch of different kinds of crops and animals on the land and limit the pesticides, what it can do for our health individually and our public health. And I learned a ton. I really hope that you all enjoy this podcast and the practical suggestions for supporting regenerative farmers. Alex is really going for it and inspiring to me. So without further ado, please enjoy the conversation with Alex Edquist. Alex, thank you for joining. Appreciate you being here. I sent a few things over in the prep, and you piqued my interest when you asked me to talk about cows, and specifically why cows are actually really good for the environment. So what can you tell us about cows?
Yeah. So cows tend to get blamed for every environmental ill. It's, kind of every day you see in the paper, everyone should do meatless Mondays, cow burps are destroying the climate,
the methane,
all of this stuff.
Cow farts.
Yeah. And really what it is it's not the cow, but it's the how. So there are landscapes where we have actually, as humans, undesertified a landscape using cows. So cows are really good at a few things. So one, cow waste is actually excellent fertilizer for all other plants. So there's a lot of landscapes, especially drier ones, where if you don't have that cycle of fertilization happening, the plants just die and then it goes to desert. So you actually need animals there. So there's tons of cool stories in the Chihuahua Desert in Mexico and on parts of the Arabian Peninsula where they've turned deserts back into grasslands, which is just amazing. The second thing cows are really good at is eating plants. And you think that shouldn't matter much. But what happens is when the cow takes a bite of grass, it's like a human going to the gym. Now the plant needs to regrow back stronger, right? So what it does is it really invests into its root ecosystem. And in soil, there's billions and billions of little microorganisms all working together to feed that plant. So if you've ever seen the movie Avatar where the trees talk to each other, that actually exists. So it's called a mycorrhizal network, and it's all these plants and fungi and microbes talking to each other. And basically the plant will feed them sugars, and all these microorganisms will create nutrients, and a lot of very complicated biology and chemistry that I don't fully understand happens. But basically what happens is the plant grows back stronger. And when it does that, it actually sucks in CO2 from the atmosphere and sends it out through its roots into the soil. So that sequesters carbon. Agriculture is a third of emissions today, of carbon emissions. And one really big source of that is producing all this synthetic fertilizer. So basically, there is a process by which humans have figured out how to take the nitrogen in the atmosphere and turn it into fertilizer that you can then put onto fields, which has been amazing from the perspective it's let us feed billions of people.
Sure.
But it's a very energy intensive process. And so if you can not use that fertilizer and use cows instead, that's actually a big carbon savings as well. So basically any kind of plant will sequester carbon. But if you don't have cows or other animals to facilitate that process, a lot of times it's a lot slower. So basically, if you are concerned about your carbon footprint as a human, you actually should eat beef, but you should make sure it's beef from what's called a regenerative farm, because they're the ones who are rotating the cattle through in a way where it's actually helping the soil sequester carbon.
I'm glad you said that about what a consumer can do. They can buy a cow that's come from a regenerative agriculture farm. Can you tell us what is regenerative agriculture and why it matters?
Yes. So regenerative agriculture is basically a method and set of practices of farming where the farmer cultivates the whole ecosystem rather than one or two cash crops. And so we hear the word sustainability a lot, but regenerative is actually taking a step further. Like, how do we make the ecosystem better over time? So the joke that people in the space like to make is, if I said, Brent, like, how would your wife feel if you described your relationship as sustainable?
Hopefully that's a check the box, but hopefully that's like level 1.
Right. Exactly. So when we say like you're aspiring to have a regenerative relationship where you both grow over time, right? And it gets better over time. So that's kind of the difference between how farmers think about sustainability versus regenerative. Okay. And so there's not one specific definition of regenerative in the way that there is for organic, because it does depend on the context so much. So there are things that will work on, like a vegetable farm in Georgia that don't work on a big cattle ranch in Texas and vice versa. But generally, there's a few common principles. So one of them, like we already talked about the cows, is the integration of plants and animals. So before humans invented synthetic fertilizer, I think it was like 96% of farms had both plants and animals, because animal waste is plant food and vice versa.
Sure.
Now only 4% of farms have both. So that's just very unusual. And also just like think of any natural ecosystem, right? There's never a place where you have just plants or just animals. Like you always have both. The second practice is you always want to keep the soil covered. So if you've ever driven through a rural area in the winter and seen like just the acres and acres of just brown dirt, that's actually horrible because all that soil will erode away. Like every time it rains, every time there's a windstorm, like some of it will leave the farm. And so you want to have something covering the soil at all times to protect it.
What kind of something, like tarps or?
So a plant. So some sort of living,
life. Okay,
sort of living root. I mean, I guess you could cover everything with tarps and that would also keep the soil from eroding away, but it would violate like all the other principles.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. As soon as that came out of my mouth, I wish I could go back and not have it come out of my mouth.
Yeah. But there are some places where, so think about like places where humans have done terraces into hillsides to keep the soil in place. Like that's a version of, that's not a natural way of maintaining soil, but it is one way of making sure that soil doesn't erode away.
Okay.
But the third principle is you want to keep a living root in the soil as long as possible. So like here in Georgia, that's a lot easier because plants grow all year round. Somewhere like Canada, where you have winter, you're not, the plant's going to be dead during the winter. But when you can't have a living root in the soil, you want to have a living root in the soil. So what these farmers will do is they'll have their cash crops, and then in between they'll plant what's called cover crops, which is a crop you're not going to harvest, you're not going to sell it, but it's kind of taking care of your soil over the winter in between growing seasons.
Okay.
Then the fourth thing is you want to minimize chemicals as much as you can. Because I talked about all this like crazy soil biology that's happening. And a lot of the farm chemicals we use just kill that. Which, by the way, I haven't even gotten to the human health implications of all this yet, but I will. And what it's doing to the soil microbes, it'll also do to you. So you want to minimize chemicals. And then the last thing you want to do is actually disturb the soil as little as possible. So when you think farming, usually the first thing people think of is like a farmer with their plow, right? And plowing is actually bad a lot of the time because what it does is, how we talked about those like mycorrhizal networks, like all the plants talking to each other. Every time you plow, you're like ripping those apart. And so, there are limited use cases for it, but the, habit of like we plow, 3-4 times a year is actually really bad for the soil. It doesn't let that good, healthy soil biology and community grow. So just like another fun fact, so I think 50% of the total excess CO2 in our atmosphere is from agriculture, and a lot of it is from plowing because when a farmer plows, all that carbon that was in the soil escapes into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And so when people think of climate culprits, they tend to think of fossil fuels first, but agriculture had the 10,000-year head start on fossil fuels. So when you look at the total effect over time, agriculture has actually been worse. But as I was saying about the cows, like that's a reversible process. We can put the carbon back in the soil in the way that we can't unburn a fossil fuel. So that's one of the reasons why it's exciting.
So regenerative agriculture as a percent of total agriculture in the US, like can you roughly contextualize it for us on where it is?
Yes. So again, like I said, there's no definition yet. So that means it's hard to assess this. And it's also, it's a spectrum. So if you look at, how many farmers are using at least one of these practices? So they are going without plowing, or they're organic, or they are, using cover crops. It's like 35 to 40% of farmers. But then if you look at the other far end of the spectrum and see like who is doing all of these things and is certified for it, it's way less than 1%. So there's a ton of opportunity here to really increase that. And so we're seeing a lot of folks like USDA and all the food brands who have these big ESG goals. Like everyone's pushing farmers really hard to get further down that spectrum.
Yeah, I would say my exposure to this has been watching The Biggest Little Farm documentary on Netflix. And I feel like the two enduring takeaways were, one, once they got there, it felt like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be and the kind of food that I want to eat.
Yeah.
But two, like, wow, that looked incredibly hard to pull off as a farmer. And like, you have to be so committed to the bit to go with that all the way. So what is in this for farmers?
Yeah.
And like, what does that mean for their economics and their livelihood? And why don't more people do it? Like, what does this look like if you're a farmer trying to think about how to grow?
Yeah. So, I mean, what you saw in the documentaries was right. Like doing this is much harder for farmers. Like it just requires more time and energy and, it's just harder. And so, but the upside is if you do it, once you kind of like get through the transition, your farm is generally more profitable.
Okay, so let's unpack that. One, you mentioned the transition.
Yeah.
What does the transition look like? And I'm curious to know more about kind of the difference in profit and what that looks like.
Yeah. So the transition from going from conventional back to regenerative, it's kind of like if your soil is someone who hasn't been to the gym in 10 years and is trying to get back into shape. Like it's just going to hurt at first. Like that biology just needs time to build back up, and like the way the soil is literally structured needs time to kind of regather itself. And so it can take 3 to 5 years to go from a conventional farm to a regenerative one. And what we often see is the farmer has a yield dip. And so it's called the J curve, where, the farmer starts, call it at 0. They go to -10 and then they end up at +10. But again, because farmers operate on such little profit margin, asking them to accept going down to -10 for a few years, like could mean them losing the farm.
Yeah.
So there's also, kind of a capital need that's here of like, I have to buy different equipment. I have to be able to finance my way through the transition. I have to be able to like find new markets for maybe some different products that I'm going to end up having. So there's a lot of like financial and non-financial costs that go into making this transition.
Yeah, I mean, my brain was totally going to the capital market piece of this as you were mentioning. Like, are there players who are investing in folks to weather that dip in the J curve and then, taking an incremental share of profits on the other side? Like how robust is the financial infrastructure? Yeah.
So there's a lot of startup organizations that are starting to do this in different creative ways. The challenge is the amount of financing that's available just pales in comparison to the need. So,
what do you mean? What specific need?
The farmer's financial needs. So there's a really cool company called Mad Capital, and I think they raised like $100 million to help farmers transition. And that might help 50 farmers because again, if we're talking about like a farmer losing revenue for 2 to 3 years, that ends up being a lot of money especially across some of these bigger farms. The other challenge is, and I know we were going to get into policy later, but I have to go there now. Sure. So the way the United States has historically supported farmers is through the public crop insurance program. And so basically what that ends up doing is subsidizing farmers with cheap insurance so that if something happens on the farm, they have enough revenue from the government that they won't go out of business. And so again, the government has decided to do this to make sure that, the United States produces way more food than it's ever going to need. It's kind of a national security thing. And so, that's kind of like historically why it's been there. The challenge is when it comes to the details of how these programs are administered, basically it's much easier to get insurance if you're only growing one thing at a time. So like the biggest little farm probably like 3 years ago would not have been able to get crop insurance because there's just too much going on their farm. Now, recently the USDA has revamped that to make it a little bit easier, but like folks haven't caught on to those programs yet. The other thing is there's kind of like a, standard of care to get insurance. So you have to be farming in these certain ways in order to qualify for insurance. And, historically that was so like, hey, Joe Schmo who starts a farm and has no idea what he's doing and obviously doesn't grow anything, like can't get free crop insurance, right? They want to make sure you're actually doing it right. But the challenge is a lot of these folks who are using some of these regenerative practices, it means they can't get insurance. So again, this farmer who grows corn and soybeans and runs his cattle on it, like he doesn't buy any chemical inputs whatsoever. And so USDA is likely to look at that and say, whoa, like you're not using any nitrogen fertilizer, you're not using like any of these products, like no way can we give you insurance. Like obviously you're going to fail.
And that's changing, or that has changed?
So USDA has announced some changes to the program. I don't know how real they are yet. But it's slow. And the other challenge is these regenerative farms are literally more resilient. So like when California had all the floods last year, a lot of the farms were just completely underwater, literally. But there were some cool examples from regenerative farms where they're like, my soil absorbed all that water and held it because the soil was so healthy. And so that farmer, even though they got flooded too, didn't actually need crop insurance, right? And so you could imagine a world in which USDA actually says, hey, if you're using these practices, we give you a bigger discount on insurance because you're less likely to need it. That requires changes in the Farm Bill that are probably not coming anytime soon. So then the challenge is if you are a regenerative farmer and you can't get crop insurance, that also makes it really hard to go to the conventional bank that finances most farms and get a loan, because the bank is like, you don't have insurance. If like you get hit by a tornado and you lose your whole crop, like there's no way you can pay the loan back. And so this set of policies just creates it makes it just very difficult for the regenerative farmer to navigate this transition without taking a ton of risk.
Yeah. It's almost like regenerative agriculture needs its own economy.
Yes. And so that you see that's like emerging on the other side. And the ironic thing is like USDA is also pouring billions of dollars through their conservation arm to help farmers transition. But then like the other parts of the agency are like funding the conventional farmers and not the regenerative farmers. So it's like you just like it's kind of at loggerheads right now. They haven't. And again, they're working to change, but it's a giant government agency and it takes forever for them to change.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I feel like it's almost implicit, but I want to hear it. Like, why does this matter?
Yeah. So it matters for several big reasons. So one, we've touched on the climate thing a few times. So there are some estimates out there of like, we can basically like resolve the climate crisis if we just made the whole world regenerative agriculture overnight. Because basically the soil has so much carbon sequestration potential that we can just do that. And of course, there's studies on the other side saying like that's not going to be enough. I am not a climate scientist, so I don't know like where we are on that. But there's other environmental factors as well. So, for example, when farmers are really reliant on chemical fertilizers, like those things end up in the waterways. You have like this whole like death zone in the Gulf of Mexico where all this fertilizer runoff has gone into the Mississippi River, and then flown out of the Mississippi Delta. And like, there's this patch like 100 miles wide where there's no fish because it's just being poisoned by all this fertilizer. And like, you can't drink the tap water in Iowa. Like there's just too much nitrogen in it. And what we've heard anecdotally a lot, like a lot of farmers, like one of the reasons why they transition is because they had a family member, die early of cancer or of Parkinson's or some other disease. And they're like, it's the chemicals. I know it was the chemicals that caused this. And so like Parkinson's rates have increased like 10x over the past few years. And, every farmer you talk to will tell you like it's because of the chemicals. So there's a lot of like environmental human health implications as well. And then the upside of this is regenerative agriculture products are also literally more nutrient dense. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if the soil ecosystem is healthier and has all these bugs, which help, turn the minerals into soil into like something that the plants and therefore the human can use, like more of those nutrients end up in the food product. And then when humans eat it, there's just more available. So like there have been some really cool studies where like a regenerative blueberry has 8 times the amount of antioxidants as a regular blueberry. And like a regenerative grass-fed cow is full of like omega-3 fats, which are good for you, versus like a grain-fed cow from feedlot is full of omega-6 fats, which are not good for you. And so there's just like lots of cool evidence on that side of what it does on the human health side as well. And it's like one thing that just boggles my mind is like, 60% of the country is obese and like more than half the population is metabolically unfit. Like, it does come back to the food we eat. And as the food is getting less nutrient dense over time because the soils are losing their nutrients, like your body wants to eat more because it senses it's not getting the nutrients it needs. And so I don't know like what percentage, how much of that is responsible for like the obesity crisis we're seeing, but it's a contributing factor for sure.
Yeah. Is the actual farming harder too? Like, is the process of running a farm more difficult, or is it more, you got to weather the curve, as you mentioned? Like, I would imagine they got to manage more crops.
Yes.
So they have to take the market in more ways. Like, what else makes it more difficult as a farmer? Yeah.
So it's, the day-to-day on the farm is harder because you're managing more things, right? And what that also means is these farmers oftentimes don't have an off season. So for a lot of like cash crop farmers, there's a lot of work in the spring around planting, a little bit less work in the summer, and then a lot more work around harvest. But then over the winter, you don't do much. Versus if you're trying to farm regeneratively, okay, well now over the winter, like I need a cover crop strategy. I need to figure out where I get some cows or some other animals to like graze the land. I need to like look at more soil test data and see like what nutrients my soil is missing so that I can plant the right cover crops. I need to figure out like my equipment strategy. I need to install fencing for these animals I'm trying to bring in. It's just a lot more stuff to do. And it means that there's no off season anymore. And then the other set of things of what you said around like, okay, well now I have more things I've produced. How am I going to sell this stuff? And so that makes that process a lot harder as well. And one of the things that a regenerative farmer can often do is get a price premium, right? Because they're making a better food product. But getting the price premium is a lot harder than just like going to the local grain silo and selling at a commodity price. So there's more upside, but it's more work to go get that.
Yeah. Where do they take those to market?
So a lot of them will sell direct to customers. That's your farmers market farmers. A lot of them will sell into wholesale markets. But the problem is you have to have a certain quantity of stuff to be able to reach a wholesale market. So if you're trying to grow 50 different things, that might be good for the environment, but then you have like small quantities of 50 different things and like no wholesale buyer wants that.
Sure.
And a lot of them will sell to high-end restaurants because again, they have a premium product. It tastes better because it's more nutrient dense.
Do they have to sell that at a premium price to be able to make ends meet?
No, they don't.
Okay. It's obvious why you would if you could.
Yeah. So it oftentimes depends on the size of the farmer too. So a larger farmer with more acres has enough economies of scale where they can get the cost reduction on the input side, and that makes it worthwhile for them. But there's also a lot of farmers who have a few acres, and if you're not getting a price premium, like you just can't make money from having that little land. So there's also this interesting like equitable economy, rural economy thriving question that goes into regenerative agriculture, because the small farmer can actually make it if they farm regeneratively. It's a lot of work, but you can make it work. And so like if you only have a few $1,000s and can buy 1 acre, you can make a living on that. But if you're trying to farm
you can make a living on 1 acre?
Yeah. because, you plant a lot of different stuff. So like we have our smallest customer is a farmer who she has a 1/4 acre in her backyard, and she makes like $200K a year. And what she does is it's an herb nursery. So they're very small plants. Sure. She basically like starts plants for other people and then sells them from there. But yeah, so you can make small scale farming work, but again, you have to get that price premium.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So if you're trying to get into farming, it's a lot easier to buy 1 acre than 1,000.
Of course. What do you think is what's the ideal size?
Depends on what you're growing.
Okay.
So I mean, if you're doing
Georgia,
if you're like growing fruits and vegetables to sell to farmers markets and high-end restaurants, like not very many acres, less than 10. But if you're trying to do like cattle ranching, like 1,000 is better. So it depends on what you're growing and what your context is. And also what you like to do as a farmer.
So good agriculture. So I think you started to allude to this when you talked about talking to 100 farmers, hearing about common problems. What is it that you all are doing, and what were those patterns that emerged in the conversations that you decided to try to go solve?
Yeah. So what we decided to work on was the everything else that goes into running a farm. And part of that's because I am not a farmer. Like the ironic thing is like I have a total black thumb. I try to garden every year and I kill everything. Like if I had to grow my own food, I would starve. So when these farmers say everything is hard, I was like, well, I can't help you with the farming piece. But if it's like, hey, I need someone who can like do my books and help me understand like what's making and losing money, like I can do that. So, and I also have a co-founder. She's a farmer, but before she was a farmer, she was a data scientist. And so she's also been trying to like bring data and analytics to like how you actually run a farm business.
A classic combination of farming and data science.
Yes. It's, she's a unicorn for sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And she's actually a good example of like, she has, I think like, she grows 2 acres of you-pick strawberries in Atlanta city limits. And, that farm makes money because if you have 2 acres of you-pick strawberries, especially they're regenerative you-pick strawberries, they have no chemical.
You-pick strawberries? Sorry.
Oh, so that's when someone pays you to come to the farm and they pick it themselves. So it's like a family activity.
Okay.
So, she can charge like $25 a person and then $10 a pound for the strawberries, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that's an example of like a small scale model that works, right?
It's like Tom Sawyer getting Huckleberry Finn to paint the figs.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you get the 4-year-olds to come out pick the strawberries.
What does she do during non-strawberry season to keep that soil covered and to make sure that there's animals there too? Like how does that part of it work? If it's in Atlanta. Yeah.
So she is too small to have like actual livestock on the farm. Yeah. So like you can't have a cow on 2 acres.
Sure.
But she does a lot of cover cropping. And she'll plant a very diverse mix, and that helps get different nutrients into the soil. And then she also does a lot of nutrient sprays to kind of address like specific deficiencies in her soil. And like one, I was talking about regenerative agriculture is very context specific. Because she's on an urban site, like really weird things have been dumped on the farm over its lifetime, like before she ended up on that land. And so she's constantly fighting like just the weird stuff that unearths itself. So again, it just requires a lot of soil testing, soil analysis, problem solving on the farmer's part. And I was trying to remember what the original question was.
What do you all do? What is good
agriculture?
Yes,
what do we do? So we help farmers. So we're trying to build a platform that will handle the farmer's whole back office. So the vision is to be able to take everything off the farmer's plate so that they can just focus on the farming. And so that we think that will help enable regenerative to be the default way we farm. Because yes, regenerative is hard, but if that's what the farmer's focusing on, and this is the stuff they're good at anyways because they're farmers, then we can handle the rest and they can have a thriving farm business. And so kind of imagine like, this is a good example of like, you're starting a business and you're being a franchisee. You're not trying to like start your own gyms from scratch, right? With like, it's all the own branding and the SOPs and whatnot. It's like, hey, I want to like build 3 of these things and they're handling some of that stuff for you. And you have to like figure out your own context, right? But some of it's handled for you. And so we want to kind of like bring the same model to the farms where, if you want to start a farm business, like, yes, you have to go figure out the farming piece, which is hard, but we've got a lot of it taken care of for you.
Totally. When I think about our conversation so far, it seems like tremendous potential, perhaps a wave building, but slow going. Like, what are going to be the tipping points that take regenerative agriculture from something that, enthusiasts know need to happen to a mainstream curve of adoption, funding, use, desire? Is it on the consumer side? Is the insurance play and the USDA what needs to happen first? Like, what leads to what, and what do you want to see tip?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of all of the above. So I think if we got it really right on either the supply or the demand side, then it would fix a lot of the problem. But obviously, like, both is better because it's just going to take a lot to change both. So on the consumer side, I think the area that is most exciting is around this nutrient piece. So imagine a future where you can bring a little sensor with you to the grocery store and you can scan all of the, produce, and you can actually, like, it'll scan the apple and say, like, this apple has like this much vitamins in it. And like, oh, this one has like twice as many vitamins in it. And, the more nutrient dense apple is only 50 cents more. Like, you might buy that apple instead. Like today, the consumer, it's very difficult for the consumer to know what's actually nutrient dense, right? So like, you can taste it once you've bought it, and like, we as humans can taste nutrients pretty well. So that's why, like, when you go to a fancy restaurant, like, the food tastes better than it does if you just like, buy random apples at like Walmart or whatever. Nothing against Walmart, but it's like a
leading supplier of organic produce in our country.
Yes. But yeah, that's actually true. But even like organic produce sometimes has this challenge of like, it's not actually that nutrient dense because the soil is not biologically active.
Yeah.
So I
think,
think,
is there a way to know that as a consumer? So
not yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if you can shop from a farmer and you like know where it's coming from and you can taste the difference, then that's a good indicator that's more nutrient dense. The problem is when you go to a grocery store, there's no way to like visually look at something and know. But there are like the little handheld device I'm talking about, like some folks are actually working on building that. So like maybe 5 years from now, you'll be able to do that.
So it'll live in the store, or I'll have one, or?
I don't know. It's a good question. It would be very cool to have them in the stores though.
Okay. I cut you off. I'm going to come back to consumer because I got a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
But like tipping points in general.
Yeah. And then I think another big one would be restructuring the insurance system to reward the folks who actually are more resilient and are less likely to need insurance. Mm-hmm. So it's just like when you get your auto insurance today, like if you're a safe driver, you pay lower rates. If you're someone who's had like 4 car accidents in the past few years, you pay more. So if we can say like, okay, we've run the risk models and like the regenerative farmer, like if there's a drought or a flood or like something crazy happens, they're way less likely to actually need the insurance payout versus the conventional farmer who is more likely to need that. I think that would make a huge impact because it would have tons of downstream effects for like, banks being able to finance things, and you don't need these like niche regenerative agriculture players who come in with this like cool way of deploying capital. You can just be like every ag bank in the country can just follow along.
So why doesn't that exist today? Like, why doesn't someone just start a regenerative agriculture oriented insurance company and like that's the product that they put out?
Because you're competing against government subsidized insurance.
Yeah.
So which you can't do, right? No. So there are insurance products out there outside of like USDA crop insurance, but it's minimal because again, you're competing against something that's subsidized. Mm-hmm. So if you are farming something that is eligible for like USDA crop insurance, there's no reason why you would go to like a private player because you're just going to pay way more for it.
Got it. So basically, like, let's say, I don't have the subsidies, so my insurance naturally has to cost a little bit more. Yeah. I can't price that better for somebody because so far fewer of my insurance clients would actually be ones who are accessing it and using it.
Yeah, I mean the subsidy rates
making claims, I guess.
The subsidy rates are so high. Mm. So and again, I'm not an expert in this, but basically like it doesn't matter. Like you as a private company can't be so much more profitable and smart about it that you can overcome how much like discount the farmers get from doing the federal program.
Got it. So the federal regulation is really what needs
it's key.
To okay.
It's key. And then there's, just like I think the other thing is like the intermediate is the food brands themselves. because a lot of them have made big ESG goals. And if you are like Pepsi or Walmart's actually a good example, like they've made a huge goal, like transition their supply chain to regenerative. And so you don't even like need the consumer asking for it, like asking for like this regenerative specific product, but you can just say like the consumer wants the companies to like be good ESG stewards. And for these food brands, the easiest way to do that is say like our whole supply chain is regenerative, and they push the farmers they're buying from to transition, like offer incentives and that kind of stuff.
Got it.
So,
and then who's monitoring it at this point? Like we mentioned earlier, there's no like USDA organic stamp like there is, or regenerative stamp like there is for organic.
Yeah.
Like, who's saying what qualifies and doesn't?
Yeah, it's the Wild West right now. So there are some certifiers that have popped up. Some of them are very good and very rigorous. Some of them are like, you know, to qualify, all you need is like a plan that describes how you are going to transition over the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, there's been some cases where like a food brand is claiming that like, oh, we're buying from this regenerative farmer. And then you like look at the farm and it's 1,000-acre farm where like 10 acres is in cover crop. So that counts as regenerative. So it's kind of like the carbon credit market right now. Like it's a little bit all over the place. And so that will get sorted out over time. And actually, the state of California is trying to come up with a definition for regenerative, which the USDA will probably copy. So there probably will be a USDA certification like there is for organic in the next 10 years.
Got it. If you had to start something in the regenerative space that wasn't good agriculture, what would you start?
It definitely would not have been a certifier. Absolutely not. Because that's a tough problem.
What would it be?
That's a good question. I've actually never thought of that one. I think it might have been like an insurance agency that specializes in these revamped programs that USDA has updated for more diversified farmers. Because I think like all of the farmers we work with, like, I don't think any of them are taking advantage of these programs, even though they exist. And again, they have the same level of like federal subsidy. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity for some insurance brokers to get really smart about these programs and then just go to like all of the more diverse farmers all over the country and just sell them like this specific type of crop insurance. So like, hey, 3 years ago, this product was horrible and like you couldn't do it, but like now it's easier and like we're going to help you with the paperwork. And like, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Interesting. Consumers. Would love to talk about if you're a discerning consumer who wants to participate more in regenerative agriculture and eat that. One, like, how do you do it? And then two, like, what would you say to make it matter to a skeptic who says, you know, sure, I try to eat healthy, but like I got a lot going on. It's already enough to think about when I go to the grocery store and like trying to stretch my dollar here. So I got to make some trade-offs. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I'm going to start with the like hardest part first, which is I'm trying to stretch my dollar. And like the challenge is right now, like the regenerative stuff is more expensive. And so again, I think there's kind of a long-term trade-off of, you know, maybe I get, you know, I have these like long-term health benefits and I'm like saving a lot of healthcare costs down the road. So there's actually a very cool study happening now where this hospital in Arizona is treating cancer patients with standard of care plus regenerative produce to see if that gives better outcomes than just standard of care. And so that kind of research is really promising, but it's not there yet. But that doesn't really help if you're like, hey, I'm living paycheck to paycheck today. And like, yes, I would like to, you know, worry about myself 40 years from now, but that's just not, like, I just don't have the budget for that. And that's tougher. But there are still some things you can do. So one, there are things that are like just great bang for your buck. So like if you go to the farmer's market and buy eggs from like a local farmer, those are oftentimes cheaper than the grocery store eggs. And then if you can also go and just get like weird cuts of meat. So if you are willing to buy like the chuck roast instead of the steak, then the regenerative chuck roast is definitely cheaper than the grocery store steak.
And is all going to be literally say regenerative? Like, are you going to, how do you differentiate at a farmer's market? What's regenerative? What's like, oh, that's just a farmer that's local. Like, it's a good question. And it just like, you know, just ask
one of the like best things you can do if you can do it is like buy from your farmer. So like go to the neighborhood farmers market, sign up for a CSA, and like just ask the farmer how they grow stuff.
What like buzzwords, like what do you look for to let somebody, you mentioned earlier, like sustainable isn't doing it, like regenerative is doing it.
Yeah.
What words, if you are the consumer that you ask, how do you grow your stuff? What do you want to hear somebody say to know like, okay, cool, this is actually doing something different for me from kind of a nutrient and health perspective?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is just like ask the farmer about their soil health practices. And not all farmers use the word regenerative either, which is like regenerative is kind of the buzzword, but not everyone thinks of it that way. And if your farmer like starts going off on like this delighted overview, like super in depth about like their soil microbes and like all the things they do, then you're like, okay, this is a good farmer to buy from. If you ask your farmer about the soil health practices and they're like, then, they're probably not using the practices that would lead to healthy soil, which is going to lead to healthier food. Also just ask like what chemicals they use. I mean, hopefully the answer is very few. And like a lot of local farmers will be either organic certified or they will do what's called certified naturally grown, which is like organic, but it's a lot cheaper to get the certification. So it's the same standard, but it's just, it's verified, but basically like farmers do peer review instead of like the government doing it. So that's another good certification to look out for. And then if you're buying any meat products, like ask how the animal was raised. Like, was it on pasture its whole life? Because grass-fed is a lot healthier than grass-finished. Ask if they rotate their animals. So if you have like cows in a big field, like that's not great for the climate because the cows tend to like overeat some of the grass and like never eat some of the grass. But if the farmer is rotating them every day through a bunch of little paddocks, then that's where you get those really good environmental benefits. So yeah, the things I would ask about which chemicals they use, ask about their soil health, and then ask like, are their animals on pasture and are they rotated? And if you're just like trying to go to the grocery store and doing the best you can, like you will start to see regenerative labels on some stuff, but it can be rare. So like organic is still better than conventional. And then like if you see a regenerative label, that's often good. And then again, just like taste the thing and see if you can like really taste, like it tastes more like the food it's supposed to. So I think like the best example is like tomatoes. Like the average grocery store tomato doesn't actually taste like anything. Versus like the tomato you grow in your garden or that you got from your local farmer, like it tastes like a tomato, right? And so if you can kind of like identify places to buy stuff from where it has that really great taste, then you're probably getting a good product. And then, I would just encourage people to like when I moved to Atlanta, I found a local farmer that sells meat. And so all I did at first was just buy meat because what they would do is you just buy like $100, $200 worth at a time. They would deliver it to your house. Like you didn't have to go to the grocery store. It's pretty easy. And you're making a difference because like meat is one of those things we're getting, like the feedlot cow was an environmental disaster. The regenerative cow is great. And it's a much bigger difference than like the conventional tomato versus the non-conventional, like the regenerative tomato. So like that's an easy place to start. Or like eggs from the farmer's market is another easy place to start because they're not that much more expensive and they're so much better. And then just kind of like, as you go over the months, like just see like, okay, what's another thing that I can like substitute? What's another thing that I can substitute? And then like, because I mean, for me, it was like probably a 5 to 10 year journey of like transitioning the pantry. And so now most of what I buy is regenerative, but it like took a long time, like find all those vendors and that's fine.
Yeah, totally. Would love to explore a little bit on future vision and kind of where this is going. And first, like, I'm curious if you had a 0 to 100 kind of optimism scale, like where's your optimism scale about, like, can we fix this? Do we want to? Like, I hear things like Walmart shifting their supply chain to be regenerative oriented. And I feel like a flicker of hope. Yeah. Like where's yours right now?
Yeah. So the reason why I'm in regenerative agriculture as opposed to like other good for the world fields is I feel very optimistic about it. So I would say I'm like at 95 out of 100.
Wow.
And there's a few reasons. So one, nature is very good at healing itself. We just have to allow it. Sure. So like all the examples we've seen of like undoing the desert, Like that's very feasible. And, I don't think we've seen a situation where we've like damaged something so beyond repair that like given some good stewardship and some good science, like we can't like restart the ecosystem. We just have like as a society make the choice to. And what we're seeing is we are starting to make the choice to do that. So if you look at like developed countries, we have way more forest than we did 100 years ago. Like it's just amazing like how much we've reforested like the United States and Europe. And so like that's happening, which is exciting. The second reason to be optimistic is this is a choice we can make that doesn't have any negative trade-offs for the end consumer. So like fossil fuels is another good example of like, if we want to improve the climate, we have to get rid of fossil fuels. But the problem is like fossil fuels are great. Like solar, it doesn't work when the sun goes down. Like nuclear, there's all these like risks of just like an implosion. Like, like a nice gas burning power plant is like kind of great. It's very good at what it does. That trade-off does not exist with regenerative agriculture. Like we could just like literally have better food. And, if we can just like kind of fix the policy system behind it, like it doesn't have to be more expensive. Like it is today, but it doesn't have to be. And so we just have to make the choice, like move towards it. But I don't think we're going to face the same like pushback from consumers of like, you're making my energy bills go up or, like, well, you're taking away my steak, but I like my steak. Things like that. Like we don't.
Yeah. You're making my steak taste better.
Yeah. It's like, I'm giving you a better steak.
Yeah.
So that's why it's easy to be optimistic about this space. Like, yes, is it going to require a ton of work? Yes. But like, I firmly believe in the human race's ability to like figure it out when we have our backs against the wall and, like nature's on our side on this one.
Yeah. Are we talking 1 decade? Are we talking 5 decades? Like what's the horizon on making meaningful change?
Yeah. It just comes down to like how we as a society, like how fast we as a society choose to move. So I think like nature, depending on like which ecosystem it is, needs, 5 to 20 years to recover. So it just like depends on like when do we want to start all of those things.
Yeah. How close, so potentially dumb question here. That has never stopped me. How close to like a farm does a piece of land need to be to become a farm? Like if you just went and had, relatively undeveloped land in the North Georgia mountains or a place that was previously a cotton field and then maybe somebody has planted pine trees there. Can that like become a regenerative farm?
Yeah.
Or like, can it pretty much happen anywhere where there's dirt? Like what's the constraints of where it can become a regenerative farm versus not?
Yeah. So again, this is why defining regenerative is hard because the context matters so much. So like the timber farm in South Georgia, if you thinned out the pines enough for like a little bit of grass to grow, that's a great like cattle ranch right there. So actually like one fun fact is cattle do better, like they grow faster when they're in a forestry system because like the shade really helps them out. So it's much better to have like a field with trees than it is to just have an open field if you're trying to raise cattle, especially in the South where it's hot. So like that's an easy transition to make. So it just depends on like, what are you trying to do? What makes sense for that landscape?
Got it. Okay. So 95 points on the optimism scale.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It's an exciting space.
Cool. What did I not ask that I should have if anybody is interested about regenerative agriculture? And if the answer is nothing, we'll just edit this out and that's totally fine. But like, I feel like we've covered a lot of really good stuff around why it matters, your journey, what y'all are trying to do in the space, like some of the tipping points that might get there. Anything else that kind of tends to come up or that you think is of interest that we didn't touch on yet?
I think the other dynamic that is interesting in the space of like is like the people who are choosing to become the farmers. So agriculture is an industry that has like long had a little bit of a brain drain where the people who are running the farms tend to be like 60, 70 years old. Their kids look at the way a farm business works. It was like, I want no part of that. Like you do all this work for like so little money and you got all this like chemical exposure and you're just like, no, thank you. Like I'm going to stay in the city and not come back to the farm. And then that hurts the farm communities because like their young people are leaving and not coming back. And so the other exciting thing about regenerative agriculture is like, it is invigorating this like next generation of like, oh, this is a cool way to run a farm. Like, I get to use my brain a lot more and I get to farm in a way that like makes me feel like I'm making an impact. And like if I didn't inherit a farm from my parents, like I can get started on a couple of acres and like make money. So like, yes, it's a tough career path to pick. Like nothing about this is easy, but it is doable in a way that like, I want to start a conventional farm and I need like 2,000 acres to break even is not doable unless you inherit the land. Yeah. And then there's like all this excitement about like, how does it reinvigorate these rural communities? And then how is it, like these families are kind of like farming in a way where it actually like improves their health and isn't like putting them at risk for Parkinson's or some of these other awful things in their later years. So I think that part of it is really exciting as well.
Yeah, totally. What's the role of technology? So, a lot of these conversations and the reason I even started this was exploring how AI plays a role in spirituality and especially forming the world that we want to see in the future. And, I kind of have an overarching belief that technology is going to help us attain whatever it is that we're seeking and setting our sights on. And so we got to make sure it's something good, worth setting those sights on. Yeah. What's the role of tech here in kind of regenerative agriculture, especially generative AI?
Yeah. So part of the challenge of regenerative is there's suddenly a lot of stuff to manage now. And like when you're at a small scale, the farmer can just like have it all in their head. But like as the farm grows, the farmer just can't keep track of like all of the details for 10 different enterprises in their head, right?
Because they're selling 10 different crops in 10 different places.
Yeah, well, not even just the selling, but just like the raising the thing of like, when did I plant it? What did I put on it? Did that work? How long do I need till harvest? Like how long will it keep an inventory before it goes bad? Like all of these details.
Aggregate maintenance of the farm.
Exactly. So, we think that regenerative agriculture requires a digital transformation of the farm. Like there's not a way to manage all this stuff in your head. And so the next product we're creating, so we actually got a grant from USDA to prototype this, is a data collection and analysis tool for that diversified farm. Because right now, if you are a farmer, it's actually very hard to collect your on-farm data. Like if you are a big conventional farmer and you have the big tractor, like it'll collect the data for you for like your one, like corn crop or your soybean crop. But if you have like 10 different enterprises and you have like, your cheap tractor that's small, like you have like, maybe you can like write it down on a notepad on the tractor seat, but like, then you have to like type it into the computer later. And it's like, we know, out of all the farmers we know one farmer who tracks their data rigorously. And he literally pays someone to follow him around with a notebook for like 3 hours a day and then like type it into the computer at night, which I was like, most people aren't going to do because that's crazy. Yeah. So what we're going to build is like a voice to text tool where the farmer can narrate into their phone like what they're doing as they're doing it. So you could like, they have their phone here on their shoulder and they're narrating, and then we take that voice data and then an AI turns that into like structured data points that goes into a database that then goes into a front end of like, here's what's happening on the farm. Yeah. And it's interesting, like the generative AI is obviously super exciting. I don't know how helpful generative AI is going to be on that piece. There's a longer term vision of eventually building like an agronomist chatbot where the farmer can ask like, hey, like what will happen if I use like this product on the farm instead of this product? But there's so much testing that needs to be done because like a chatbot hallucinating something in that scenario, like again, could put the whole farm at risk. Yeah. So we would want to be very careful about that. But I think there's like some really cool stuff around like integrating more IoT and like building almost like a digital twin of the farm. And, just like having really good like data collection and even just making the data available to the farmer, I think is going to make a huge difference. Just like, it doesn't need to be like the latest and greatest, coolest AI stuff. It's just like, is this stuff on the computer for the farmer to analyze? I think is going to be huge. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you. Lightning round. Yeah. If we can, just a few lightning round questions. The first one is your favorite Atlanta meal. You can take this if you want to be your favorite regenerative farm to buy food from in the greater Atlanta market if you want, if that doesn't touch on any sacred cows because you're talking about one of your customers and not another.
Yeah.
But what about, what's a favorite either Atlanta meal or regenerative agriculture farm to purchase from?
Yeah. So I end up, as you might imagine, like I end up cooking a lot of my own stuff. And it was funny. So like in particular, when I was doing customer discovery and I was like talking to all these farmers, like I felt like, well, if I'm asking you all these questions, like I gotta buy something from you. And so like each week I would end up with just like 30 pounds of food that I'd bought from these farmers. And so I was like having to host like weekly dinner parties just to like not let it go to waste. And it was funny because all my friends were like, wow, Alex, your cooking has gotten so much better. And it's like, no. All I did was just like start with a really good ingredient. Like all I did was take a really good tomato and slice it and put some olive oil on it. Like that's all I did. So yeah, if you want like people to think you're an awesome cook, like you should definitely buy from your local farmer. But like I will, since I recommended, it's like starting with meat because it's easy. Like some of these farmers will deliver. So we actually do have 2 customers, and then there's one other farm I will call out. Our 2 customers in the Atlanta area. So one is the Rural Urban Connection. So they do just beef, but it's really good beef, and they will deliver to your house in the metro area. The other farm is called Marview Farms, and so they have like every animal product you could ever want. So they have cattle and chicken and pork and sheep and goat and turkeys and, you name it, they have it. And the cool thing about them is they actually just built their own processing plant. So the animal never leaves the farm. So it's just like, for folks who are concerned about animal welfare, like this animal also has like a very humane end to its life because it doesn't have to like have the stressful trailer ride. It just goes like from the, paddock it's grazing. It's like next door to the processing facility, and they are very humane inside there. So, and they do, you do have to pick up from them, but they have like certain spots in the Atlanta area that they'll take it to. So that's Marview Farms. And then, this farm, this farm is an example of like, these farmers are actually extraordinary humans and are good at everything themselves. And this is White Oak Pasture. So they're not a customer of ours, but they're actually the ones who did that first LCA proving that their beef is carbon negative. They actually do a lot of agritourism too. So for folks who are like super interested in this topic, you can actually go to the farm and like stay on a cottage there and like get a farm tour and like see how it actually works. They are really cool folks. So would recommend you check them out as well.
Got it.
Yeah. And then just,
cool.
Shout out to your local farmer's market. Go find whatever one's closest to you. There's going to be a lot of great farmers there.
Got it. Thank you. All right. Left turn. What do you think happens to us when we die?
So, this is an interesting question because I'm an atheist who goes to church. So like, I think, yeah. So, I mean, we're talking about like, community matters and this kind of stuff. And like, you asked me like what I would work on in regenerative agriculture if not good agriculture, but you didn't ask like what I would have worked on if not regenerative agriculture. And I think, like we as a society have gotten so much less religious, but like church used to be this place where like everyone had guaranteed community. Like once a week, it didn't matter who you were, like everyone went to church on Sunday. And as we have gotten less religious, we have lost that sense of community, but there hasn't been another societal structure that's replaced that. And so then now you have this like, horrible like cult of loneliness, and like most people only have like one friend or 0 friends, and it's just like I don't know how you replace that. And on a scale from like 0 to 100 of how optimistic I am about that one, I'm at like a 10. I have no idea how you solve that. But the way that I solve that personally is like I do go to a church. But yeah, I don't like when you die. I think that's kind of like the end of the story. But what I do think that means is like the fact that life ends like gives it a lot of meaning. Because it means you have a limited amount of time, like you better go make every day count.
An atheist who goes to church. And what is it that you want from church, but that you feel like the actual spiritual message isn't delivering?
Yeah. So I find like Christianity in particular, like even though I don't believe in Jesus per se, like I do find it a very helpful philosophy of like there's a lot of love and forgiveness in the universe. There is a lot of freedom that comes from just like humbling yourself to like whatever the fates have in store for you, to just like stop and be grateful for an hour for what you have. And then also just like meet people who, I wouldn't meet at work or, through like my college friends, or like it just exposes you to different kinds of people as well, which I think is very healthy for everyone to like, have different circles that they run in and just like get different perspectives from different people.
Yeah. It's such a healthy place to localize yourself in the ongoing human story and meta narrative and kind of where you fit in, because regardless of what you think happens when you die or the purpose for life to begin with, the fact is that we are doing it just as people have for centuries and centuries. And we have all kind of had this search for meaning and community and well-being, and also living into a deep and ultimate kind of truth and way of being in the world that we think is important. And so, if I were to poke on your like, well, why does it matter that our bodies are more healthy? Why does it matter that the soil is better? Why does it matter that the animals are treated well? There's like a utilitarian answer for all of those that's very practical. And there's kind of a spiritual and worship element of that. And so I think it's interesting to hear you say, because I think a lot of my exploration in the last year has been a search for like, what do we do in this era where we have so much promise and possibility from technology, but a lot of things feel like they're at risk of going off the rails or they're suboptimal to begin with. And a lot of the places that I got back to were, we need our meaning-making institutions to work in a way that they don't currently. And the church and the religious entity, whether it's the church or another religion outside of Christianity, like that is the primary meaning-making institution for our people. And that's got to work so that we're not lonely, so that we feel connected to one another and living with a life of purpose. So I'm nodding along with you on all of those. And it's interesting to think about still getting those benefits from a religious institution, even if you don't serve yourself the main course.
So, I mean, it's interesting, like how technology plays into that in the future as well, because I think technology has proven to be very good at disrupting a lot of these things. So, I mean, like, one reason a lot fewer people are less religious is technology gives you more exposure to different ways of thinking. And so, if you grew up in a community where like literally everyone's Christian and that's all and like everyone goes to church on Sunday, like it's very difficult to question that, right? But if you have access to the internet, you'll be like, wow, there's like 2,000 religions out there, like, and then the obvious next question is like, am I really sure that the one I happen to be growing up in is like actually the right one? Because there's a lot of other options out there. And I think the challenge is like technology has done that to all of the institutions. It's like, okay, well, it's exposed us to like, all this government corruption, and it has kind of distanced us from like friends and family. And I just don't know like how we eventually like figure out a way to use that to like fix some of those things, or if it's a one-way street. I mean, have you seen any evidence of like people doing cool things with technology to like make our societal connections stronger again?
I don't know that I have specific answers on things that are happening now. What I'm optimistic about is, again, that we can use technology for any aim that we have. And so the thing that I keep coming back to is like, where are we in the evolutionary cycle? Where it's like humans been around 200,000 years. The Industrial Revolution like just happened like a half second ago. We are not evolved to have as much digital stimuli coming our way, choices about where we can live, what we can do. We're not evolved to live hundreds of miles away from our parents or in isolated, four-wall homes with just a single family instead of like tight neighbors and community. And so I think what I'm optimistic about is technology helping us understand what we're doing to ourselves that has a negative impact, and then charting a way to fix it. And regenerative agriculture actually is a great example of that. It's like understanding more about the inputs for us that are problematic, and then helping us devise a route towards, okay, what does the economy need to do to actually get regeneratively farmed products onto our plates, because that will help us live better. And I think we'll see that in a number of different ways to correct some of the shifts towards things that we're doing wrong. And I think the loneliness piece is perhaps one of the biggest ones that you've seen, where it's like, cool, you might be able to find any amount of entertainment on your screen, and that like is fulfilling your need in a very surface level, immediate gratification way. But like, we know that what ultimately fills a much deeper need is lasting, enduring relationships with other people. And so, okay, cool. Well, like, what tech problems are going to help us solve that? Like, technology will be a tool towards that aim that we have.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm optimistic about. But I don't know that I could point to specific solutions that would help us do that at the moment.
And I mean, regenerative agriculture, like, I actually do think this is another story where technology has gotten us into the mess we're in. So like, the practices I've outlined, like, these are not new to anybody. Like, humans have been doing these things for thousands of years. And, when you look at like ancient human societies, there's lots of examples where like humans did things badly and it destroyed the ecosystem. So I mean, just look at like, where the Middle East is now. Like, it used to be called the Fertile Crescent and now it's just desert. And it's because of lots and lots of bad farming. But there are also lots of examples where humans have figured out how to work with their ecosystem, and their farming practices have made the land better over time. But like, the way we farm today was not possible before, like, again, synthetic fertilizer was invented, before like, giant machinery was invented that allowed like
glyphosate, Roundup.
Right, exactly. Like, all of those chemicals. And so like, not saying we were like farming great before those things were invented, but it really accelerated this like extractive agriculture paradigm we're in. And so like, part of the solution of like moving back to regenerative is actually like, we have to use a little bit less of these things, actually just get more humans back on the land, like stewarding the land and kind of taking care of it. And just like, I think like, in a world in which regenerative agriculture is the default way we farm, like, actually way more people are going to be farmers. Yeah. Which is like that's a controversial thing to say as a tech founder. No. Like, we need more humans to do a thing. But like, I think that's like, when we think about our societal problems, like, the thing I wrestle with on the technology is like, just tech can't do it all. Like, there's culture and society and institutions that have to do a lot of hard work to make sure that technology is being used for good purposes.
Yeah. And I think there is something spiritual and sacred about that too. Like, when you think about part of the modern malaise, we are so separate from the mechanisms of our survival. Like, it's all but assured. And you know, my air conditioning has been out for the last week, and it's like, whoa, I might have to sleep in the 80 degrees. And it's just like crazy that this is happening. And it's like, all right, cool. You fast forward or rewind throughout human history, like, that's just the norm. But like, that's a very small example of all the ways that we're separated from our survival and our means of production. And so I do think that there's something to allowing us to reconnect with literally the source of life, like our food and the soil, that will play an important cultural role, psychological role, spiritual role, not just food systems. Like, I definitely see that weaving together. Yeah.
And it's something I actually see a lot as a tech founder. So especially going to these climate tech spaces, there are so many people I run into where it's like, not only have you never been to a farm, you have never talked to anyone who's been on a farm. So I just tell two funny anecdotes. So I was at a green tech conference, and the whole first day was about alt proteins, which is another I have a lot of opinions about alt proteins that I don't have to get into right this second. But I was like, okay, fine. We'll talk about alt proteins. I'll keep my mouth shut. It'll be okay. But then they're like, okay, we're all going to get out into breakout groups and talk about how do we get beef ranchers to support alt proteins. And I was like, this is just a stupid question. Like, obviously they're not going to, because that would put them out of business, and they're not just going to agree to just not ranch anymore. Yeah. I was like, can we talk about how to get beef ranchers to ranch better? Because that's a question that has solutions. And they're like, no, it has to be alt proteins. And so I haven't gone back to that conference for that reason. Yeah. And then I was at another conference with investors, and I was trying to pitch an investor about our company. He's like, well, this is not really what I'm looking for. The investment I'm looking for is a thing that you can grow it and it sequesters carbon, and then you can use it for energy afterwards, after you harvest it. And so my response was like, so you mean like a tree or a cow? And he just kind of looked at me, and then he kind of left. Yeah. But just some of the solutions for our problems, they already exist. Nature has provided. Yeah. We don't need it's fair. Trees are not a venture scalable technology solution, but like they already exist. Like, why don't we just plant more trees instead of like spending billions of dollars in R&D trying to like come up with the next great tree substitute? So I think, I guess, it's like make one recommendation for folks. It's just like, just go outside. Like just spend 30 minutes outside every day, whether it's like in a garden or like in a park or, whatever kind of scratches your itch, but like go outside. It's good for you. Like nature does something good for our biology. And there's also been some cool studies of like, people who spend more time out in nature, like have just much lower like stress markers in their blood.
Yeah. What's a book you'd recommend? When it doesn't have to be related to regenerative agriculture, but anything you've either read or gifted or recommended recently. Yeah,
my favorite book it's called Anti-Fragile, and it's kind of a philosophy book, kind of a finance book. It's written by a guy called Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who, if you've heard the phrase Black Swan, he's the one who came up with that. And so basically the whole concept is like things that are fragile, the more you change them, the more likely they are to break. But something that is anti-fragile, like gets stronger with change. And so it's like, how do you build your life and therefore like societies and institutions that improve as things change? And so that had a lot of effect on me, especially as I was thinking about like starting a business, and just, like how do I kind of prioritize things like health and like workout routines and those kinds of things. So that is a great one. And if I was going to recommend one regenerative agriculture book of just like, how does this work? So it's called Dirt, and it's written by a farmer called Gabe Brown, who is another one of these farmers who's just like an extraordinary human. He's good at everything. He's like made it work despite all the challenges. But it gives a really good overview of the benefits of regenerative agriculture and like, for someone who's not a farmer, just like an easy way to digest, like, how does it actually work?
Awesome. You may have answered this, but last question, a habit that modern culture and our individuals in it have that we got it wrong. And what's something that you would change and how we change that habit?
Yeah. And so it's like a habit individuals have.
Yeah. What's something that you see that seems to be relatively normal or commonplace in our modern society that maybe isn't serving us to the greatest degree that it could be? And how would you shift that?
Yeah. I'm going to take a really hard left turn on this one. And the thing that I see, especially in urban environments, is people our age who have dogs instead of families or instead of like tight community connections. Because I think everyone has that need for, social contact, right? And so the more you can surround yourself with family and neighbors and community and like making an impact on stuff, like the more fulfilled you will be. And I think a lot of people, instead of doing all that hard work that goes into that community building, they just get a dog. And like dogs love you unconditionally and they're great. And I'm not saying like everyone should get rid of their dogs, but like I think a couple years ago, the Pope made a comment of like, people are having dogs instead of children and like that's bad. And like he got roasted for it. But I think there's like a little bit of truth to that. Like I think it's such a need people have, and like that's a little bit of the easy way, like taking the easy way out of it, where it's like it's not going to give you the same long-term fulfillment, but it meets that immediate need. And I just think that we should try to do a little bit less of that.
Yeah.
And I realize everyone's going to hate me for that suggestion because everyone loves their dogs, but I said what I said.
No, yeah. As somebody who has a dog and had a dog before I have kids and now have 2 kids, I can confidently say that the kids are way harder than the dog, but also like was so much drastically more important.
Yeah.
At least to me and my circumstance and what it means to my life and my soul and my heart. So yeah, that resonates.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for spending time. It's been awesome.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me. It was great to see you again.
Yeah. Rooting for you. And I'll ask for some links that we can put in the show notes for ways that anybody can support you.
Yeah.
And thanks for what you're doing.
That. Thank you.
All right. That is our show. Thank you again, Alex, for the time. I trust that this is not going to be the last conversation we have about regenerative farming. And I actually hope to get a couple of Alex's customers on the phone video podcast to ask them what it's like to be a regenerative farmer and what are they seeing in the space. So super interesting. I think there's a lot of keys to our health and wellness and maybe some climate and just things to learn about. And I don't know a ton about this space other than that. I want to live well. I want to eat well. I want to be healthy. I want us all to do the same. So lots to explore there. As always, I'm grateful for you all listening. I'm open to your feedback and suggestions. Thanks for journeying with me. And please let me know if you have questions or suggestions as we go forward. Thanks for listening to the Macon Atlanta show, Macon Atlanta podcast. And we'll talk to you soon.